All right, let's start 7.1, part 3. We're almost done. All right, let's do a quick review of some of our symbols. So we know the population parameters, right? We have a population mean. We have a population standard deviation of sigma. We have a population proportion of p. All right, then if we're looking at a sample, or what we're going to call a test statistic, then we're going to look at the sample mean, which is X bar. That's our sample mean. Sometimes we're going to know sigma, sometimes not. If we don't know sigma, we do know S, which is the sample standard deviation. And then with the proportion, we're going to use p hat. That's our point estimate. And we are going to still use the normal, right? And so for the first one, we're going to use either the z-score or a z distribution, or we're going to use a t distribution. For the proportion, we're going to go ahead and use the normal distribution, the z-scores. Okay, so when we test to see if we can reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis, we have a couple of different ways we're going to do it. One way is called a p-value or a probability value. It has to do with area under the curve. StatCrunch is going to do a lot of this for us, but we do have to set up a picture and see what's going on. So we have a couple different hypothesis testing that we're going to do. We're going to have a left tail test, we're going to have a right tail test, and finally we're going to have a two tail test. And we're going to look at each of these in just a minute. But a left tail test means that our area is down here on the left, just like we were doing back in chapter 5. A right tail test, then the area is going to be here on the right. And finally, a two tail test means that we're going to have area on both sides. So both ends of our normal curve. And that's how we're going to decide whether we are going to reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the hypothesis. We're going to look at our p-value, and we're going to look at our alpha. So let's take a look. Now, when we are deciding whether we are going to use a left tail, a right tail, or a two tail, it is always based on the alternative hypothesis. I know that sounds a little strange because we're worrying about rejecting the null hypothesis, but we're going to look at the alternative. If the alternative hypothesis is pointed to the left, we're going to have a left tail test. Right? And so if the inequality is pointed to the left, then our area is going to be over here in the left. If our alternative is a greater than sign and is pointed to the right, then we're going to have a right tail test. And therefore, our area is going to be on this side. All right, and then finally, if our null hypothesis is a not equal to, then we're going to have a two-tailed test. If we're doing this by hand, we are going to have to deal with that the areas in the two different tails. If we use StatCrunch, the p-value is that the StatCrunch is going to give you is going to go ahead and take that into account. Okay, and so the smaller the p-value of the test, the more evidence there is to reject the null hypothesis. And we're going to look at actual numbers in just a minute. A very small p-value, remember the p-value is going to be the area under the curve. A very small p-value, very small area is going to be unusual, just like we've been doing for a while now. When we have an area less than 5%, which is tiny, it's an unusual event. Same thing's going to happen here. Okay, so let's set up a problem based on what they tell me. So they tell me that a school publicizes that the proportion of its students who are involved in at least one extracurricular activity is 61%. So we've looked at this one before, but let's do it again. And So the proportion of students involved in at least one extracurricular activity is curricular, 61. So P equals 0.61. That means that my alternative is P is not equal to 0.61. So since my alternative is not equal to, that means that I'm going to have a two-tailed test. It's not pointing either direction, right? It's not pointing to the right. It's not pointing to the left. Therefore, I'm going to grab both ends. Okay, and so this is a, oops, this is a two-tailed test because it's not equal to. All right, we looked at these problems before, but this time we're going to look at our the tails. So this time a car dealership announces that the mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. So a mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. So that is going to be my alternative because it does not have an or equal to. And that means that my null is going to be the complement or greater than or equal to 15. Okay, so always the equal to goes in the null hypothesis here. Because this is less than, or my claim is less than 15, I have to put it in the alternative. Then the alternative is what tells me which direction I'm going to go with my p-value. And so since I have a less than symbol and it's pointing to the left, my area is going to also go to the left, and therefore I am going to have a left tail. All right, this one is a company advertises that the mean life of its furnaces is more than 18 years. So that would be greater than 18. It doesn't have or equal to, so I'm going to put that in the alternative. So the mean life of the furnace is greater than 18. That means that I want my complement here, which is mean less than or equal to 18. So now when I go to do my, look at if I have a two-tail, a left tail, or a right tail, I'm going to work off my alternative. It is pointing to the right. Therefore, my area is going to go to the right, and I have a right tail. Always works off the alternative and tells me which direction I need to go. All right, so there is a lot going on with Chapter 7. When we find our p-value using StatCrunch, we're going to compare that to alpha. So they're going to give us our significance level. That's alpha, right? It looks like this. And we are going to compare that, whatever that significance level is. So they might give us a 99%, which means the significance level would be 0.01. We're going to take a look at all these. And then we're going to run StatCrunch and find our p-value, and we're going to compare those two areas. So if the p-value is less than or equal to alpha, then we're going to go ahead and reject the null hypothesis. If the p-value is greater than alpha, then we're going to fail to reject. So these charts are in your resource sheet. We're going to draw some pictures and look at these as well so that you have a visual look at what's going on. But this isn't always. If p is less than or equal to alpha, we're going to reject. If p is greater than alpha, we're going to fail to reject. Now then we have to start working on the claim, but we're not going to start this just yet. This wording is very tricky, which is why I have it as a table based on what was in the book, but I also have it laid out on the next page because the wording is tricky, especially if the claim is the alternative. Okay. So this will make a lot more sense when we start working on problems. It's the easiest is if the claim is the null hypothesis. So if my null hypothesis is also what the company is claiming, this is the easiest, because if we reject the null hypothesis, meaning we're rejecting the claim, right? Those two go together. So if we reject the null hypothesis, we're going to also reject the claim, because those two are the same thing. If we fail to reject the null hypothesis, then we also have insufficient evidence to reject the claim. So these two go together. What we're going to do is use this resource sheet to help us out when we are looking at our tests in the next few sections, and we're figuring out where the claim is and whether we can reject the claim or not. Now, the tricky part is when we have the alternative hypothesis as the claim. Because remember, we're always rejecting the null, or we're failing to reject the null. So if I reject the null, I have evidence support the claim, because it's one or the other, right? And we'll do more problems, you'll see this. If the claim is here, right? If the claim is the alternative, if I reject the first one, then I'm going to be able to support my claim. It's one or the other. Now, if I don't reject DNR, if I don't reject the null hypothesis, then that might be true. If I don't reject it, it's possible. And so I cannot support my claim. It's one or the other. And as we do more problems, you'll get more practice with those. All right, so this is just a quick flowchart. We've been doing this work. We're going to continue to do this work. First, we set up the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Then they'll tell us the level of significance. At that point, we're going to figure out if we have a left tail, a right tail, if two tail. Then we're going to let StatCrunch find the p-value for us. And at that point, we're going to compare. We're going to compare the p-value versus alpha and decide if we're going to reject the null hypothesis or we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. And then finally, at the end, we're going to talk about the claim. All right, that's enough for 7.1.